Hey everyone, and welcome back to OntarioCryptids. I hope you all had a fantastic week. Mine was great up until last night when I let Max and Tobi out for a midnight pee. This is the second time in 2 weeks that Tobi has gotten sprayed by a skunk. And you know what that means, staying up late and cleaning him several times. Well, enough about me. Let's move on to today's encounter stories. Today marks episode number 70, so as usual, I will be thanking those who have commented regularly on my last 5 videos. So without further ado, a special thanks goes out to Bender, Jean, and Sky King for continuing to support my episodes by liking and commenting. I also want to thank all of you who have subscribed and keep on coming back each week to watch these episodes on my channel. Thank you all so much for your support. As you know, I'm always looking for great stories to be shared on this channel. So if you have a story that you would like to share in a safe environment, then forward your encounter stories to OntarioCryptids@gmail.com. Today, I bring you a chronicle of one man's encounter over a span of 3 years, which occurred when he was a young boy. I hope you enjoy. Now, go grab yourself a beverage and get cozy on the couch or chair and sit back and relax. All right, so the first of the 3 stories that are going to be told today occurred in September of 1970, and it was the fall time. They all occur in Washoe County, Nevada. However, they appear to be different locations. So this one takes place, the nearest town is Reno, and it takes place in Peavine Mountain, northwest of Reno, Nevada, on the western face. So let's get started. I grew up in northwestern Nevada along the California border in the foothills of the Sierras. My father was a geologist who preferred working and camping in areas that were as sparsely populated as possible. Between 1970 and 1983, I had a number of encounters in Nevada, California, and Washington state. I plan to submit them individually in chronological sequence so that I can provide as much detail for researchers as possible. This first encounter occurred in 1970 on Peavine Mountain northwest of Reno, Nevada. I was 10 at the time and tagging along with my father, who was hunting deer. We were on the western side of the mountain, close to the California border. We were between 2 ridges crossing a meadow on the western face of the East Ridge. It was about 3:30 p.m., and the sun was beginning to drop behind these trees on the western ridge. There were no clouds, and it was still very bright in the meadow, but the shallow draws between the 2 ridges was heavily shadowed. As my father and I neared the center of the meadow, we heard an extended call coming from the west. We had lived in Kansas until I was 8, and the call reminded me of the World War II air raid sirens they used for tornado alerts where we used to live. It began low and relatively quiet and rose in both pitch and volume as it progressed. It lasted for about 15 to 20 seconds before rapidly dropping off. After about 10 seconds, the call was repeated. It seemed to me that it was coming from the draw a couple of 100 yards west and downhill from us. Unlike the tornado siren I was familiar with, it had a mellow rather than harsh or mechanical quality to it. As the second call ended, I asked my father what was making the noise. Annoyed, he told me that it was just a siren from the fire tower and picked up his pace. That seemed reasonable, and I began looking around at the surrounding high ground for the tower when the call sounded a third time. It seemed to be coming from the draw and seemed to be moving away from us. I caught up with my father, and being a curious 10-year-old, I asked him in rapid successions where the tower was and if he smelled any smoke. He replied that it was on the other side of their far ridge and that they were just testing the siren. I told him that I thought the call was coming from the draw, and at that point, I was told to shut up. As the call sounded a fourth time, and even further away, my father listened to it and then decided to call it a day. We walked to the Jeep and drove home without further incident. Okay, so this is his second set of the chronological reports. This one takes place in August of 1972. Again, it takes place in Reno, but it takes place in a place called Lemon Valley. I grew up several miles northwest of Reno, Nevada, in the foothills of the Sierras. My father was a geologist who preferred sparsely populated areas, so we lived, camped, fished, gold panned, rock hunted, I'm not sure what that means, guys, and hunted Indian and gold rush artifacts in some relatively remote places. And sorry for repeating this, but this has been added to all three of the encounter stories. But let me continue. The second encounter occurred in August of 1972 in Lemon Valley, Nevada. Lemon Valley is northwest of Reno on US 395. Though the area I'm about to describe is now covered with housing developments, in 1972, there were only 2 developed areas in the valley. Stead Air Force Base, deactivated in 1959, was on the west side of the valley, and the community of Lemon Valley was on the east side. The community of Lemon Valley was, in reality, simply a strip of built-up properties along Lemon Valley Road, just housing a few small businesses extended for about 5 miles towards the back of the valley, and for a couple of 100 yards at most to either side of the road. US 395 cut across the south and higher end of the valley at the base of Peavine Mountain North Slope. Towards the back of the valley, the north or lower end, were a few small ranches. Only a couple of improved dirt roads cut across the center of the valley, connecting the community of Lemon Valley to Stead. The climate was high desert, roughly 5,000 feet in elevation with negligible year-round rainfall, but sometimes several feet of snow in the winter. The humidity was generally less than 10% and often as low as 5%. Other than those planted near developed properties, there were no trees on the floor of the valley. Scrub pine begins on the higher ridge at about 5 miles west of the valley and thickens to fully developed air-raid pine forest as the elevation increases. The dominant vegetation is sagebrush mixed with a wide variety of large weeds and coarse grasses. Jackrabbits, prairie dogs, and smaller rodents were very common, as were a wide variety of lizards and snakes. Coyotes are common but rarely seen. Cougars and bears are rare, but sometimes sighted in the area. Deer sticks to the surrounding higher elevation with more trees. Other indigenous animals, including hawks, falcons, and a few burrowing owls, quail, and other ground nestling birds, are also plentiful. There is also a variety of large insect species, cicadas, locusts, etc., to round out the ecosystem. At first glance, the area may not look like it supports much in the way of life, but it actually does. Snowmelt is the primary source of open water in the late spring and early summer, and a small lake forms towards the back of the valley. By late August, this has usually dried up, and the only source of water are near human habitation. As I mentioned in my first report, the north face of Peavine Mountain was deforested in the late 1800s. It has also eroded significantly over the last century as a result of the vegetation loss due to hydraulic mining. The runoffs from the mountains was clearly heavy at some time in the past because two deep washes cut through half the length of the valley flowing north from Peavine Mountain. These washes were 8 to 10 feet deep in places with vertical walls that averaged 5 to 8 feet in width. Walking down one was much like walking through a school hallway with slight curves. Their depths would increase and decrease as they intersected the natural fingers and draws running down from the ridge that bounded the valley. They were difficult to climb in and out of except at a few places where they shallowed out to a couple of feet as they intersected a draw. Because they were shaded and contained a little more moisture than the surrounding terrain, they formed a small microclimate where certain species of lizards and occasionally scorpions could be found. The sagebrush also grew a little taller, about 3 feet along the edges. Below, the floor of the washes were almost perfectly level, shaded and protected from the wind. Very little vegetation grew on the floors of these washes and was usually limited to tumbleweed and some patches of coarse grass. From the floor to the valley, these washes were virtually invisible. You could only tell where they were from a strip of sagebrush running along their edge that was a little greener, thicker, and taller than the rest of the sagebrush in the valley. You couldn't see them or see down into them until you were right on top of them. This encounter took place in the early afternoon in mid-August of 1972. It was bright, sunny, and hot, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit at the time. The wind was less than 5 miles per hour. I was 12. I was with my brother, who was 10, and a friend, David, who was also 12. For years, my brother and I had spent the summers exploring the surrounding hills and valley. We knew all the best places to catch each type of lizard, the best places to look for arrowheads, where the trash dumps from the 1800s were, good for old bottles, and the best places to find old shell casting and such from when the air base had been active. We didn't often make it out as far as that dry washes, but when we did, we made it a point of exploring them because of the unique things like scorpions that you can find in them. We had just moved from Stead to the Lemon Valley side of the valley, and David, a new neighbor, was with us for the first and, as it turned out, only time. We had decided to go all the way out to the closest wash to show it to David, and we were angling towards one of the shallow points where it would be easier to get into. As we walked along, we were searching the ground for horned toads, arrowheads, and anything else that might be interesting. We were about 20 feet from the wash when we stumbled across an area with jasper and obsidian chips on the ground and started looking around in earnest for arrowheads and other stone tools. My brother and I were seriously competitive when it came to hunting arrowheads. I was facing north, focusing on a piece of jasper I had just found, and I had my back to my brother and David when I got a sudden feeling something was wrong. I don't know whether I heard one of them gasp or it just got abruptly quiet, but I knew there was a problem. I had a sense of where my brother was, which was a few feet behind me, and I turned to look at him. As I turned clockwise from north to south, I saw first David, about 25 feet away from me and a couple of feet from the rim of the wash. Then, what I perceived to be a giant black man about 8 feet from David and about 3 feet away from the wash. And finally, my brother, who was only about 5 feet behind me. The giant black man was about 35 feet from me, standing still, facing me with his arms at his side, looking directly at me. I guess he must have figured I was the lead male. David was in shock, rooted to the ground, staring directly at him with his mouth wide open and his lower jaw level with his collarbone. My brother was poised to run and looking from the man to me and then to David in a panic. As soon as I saw the man, I took a step to run also, but I realized that David wasn't going anywhere and we'd need to help him if the man tried to do anything. We weren't that far from Reno, and there are a lot of weird people who drift through that town. A man out of place in the desert is immediately considered dangerous. I settled my weight and looked the man in the eyes, waiting for him to indicate his intentions. This all took about a second. At this point, my brother turned to me and screamed, "That's not a man! That's not a man!" Not breaking eye contact with the man, I snapped back at him, "Yes, it is." My brother immediately yelled, "No, it's not." And I snapped right back, "Then what is it?" Which shut him right up. At that moment, in that situation, it was critically important to me that the man be nothing more than a man. I also knew my brother and I could probably get away, but David was at risk, and I intuitively sensed that it was important to control the fear, both by keeping the man just a man and by calming my brother. As I focused on the man, I recognized that he was not overtly threatening, but seemed stern and annoyed. He didn't move a muscle, and he didn't make a sound. From his manner, I gathered that he was not threatening to us, but was determining if we were a threat to him. That we had disturbed him, and he just wanted us to go away and leave him alone. My brother and I would have been happy to have obliged, but David was still standing there like a statue, and we weren't leaving him behind, so we all just stood there and stared at each other. I could see the man from the lower shins on up, and there is where it gets a little strange. He was at least 8.5 feet tall, 3.5 feet to 4 feet broad at the shoulders, and had comparatively narrow waist. His arms hung down to the top of his knees. Not only was this man huge and slightly disproportionate, but in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of August, to my perception, he was wearing a black down ski parka with the peaked hood up, matching black down ski pants and black gloves. Down ski wear was a brand new fad with the skiers that came through Reno back then. I thought to myself that it was strange that he had had this brand new ski outfit, let alone one that fit his frame. I thought he must have stolen it. I had already subconsciously assumed this guy was a hobo because we were at least a mile from the nearest road, and there wasn't any vehicle in sight. And I couldn't think of a good reason for him to have apparently been hiding in the wash. As I thought about it, the hobo assumption made sense. The ski suit was probably the only thing he had to wear, and at night, sleeping out in the open in the high desert, it tended to get a little chilly, August or not. There was even a little dirt on it in places, indicating that he's been lying on the ground. The man's bearing, though, didn't come across the way a homeless person's would. He stood tall with his shoulders relaxed but back. His posture indicated a sense of self-worth that was almost regal, and his gaze didn't flinch. As an afterthought, there was nothing about his eyes to give me the impression that he lacked human intelligence. Even under the ski suit, you could tell that he had a massively muscular upper body, and the ratio of shoulders to waist were thus of a world-class athlete. For a moment, I considered that I was looking at fur-covered muscle and immediately killed that thought, then started to look a little closer anyway. This was when he simply broke eye contact, turned, stepped down into the wash at the shallow point where he was standing and walked away down the wash without looking back. This was a little strange in retrospect because there was absolutely no indication in body language or eye movement to telegraph that he had decided our encounter was over. He simply turned and left without acknowledgement. Within a couple of steps, he disappeared around a slight curve in the wall of the wash as it cut through the next finger of the ridge. We had stood looking at each other for maybe 45 seconds. I didn't move for a couple of seconds after he disappeared, waiting to give him time to go before moving to check on David. I've never seen anybody so afraid that they were frozen on the spot before, and I was concerned about him. As I walked up to David, looking cautiously down the wash as I got a better angle on it, my brother followed me and said in a voice that seemed to beg me to believe him, "That wasn't a man." Standing in front of David, I looked him in the eye and I said, "Yes, it was." It was just a big black hobo. That ended the discussion. I asked David if he was okay. He just shook his head, yes, and didn't say anything. My brother moved up to the edge of the wash to see as far down as he could, and I asked if he could see the guy. He couldn't, and we started to leave when curiosity got better of us, and my brother asked, "What do you think he was doing down there?" I thought about it for a second and decided I wanted to know too, so we walked along the edge of the wash for 100 yards or so to make sure he wasn't hiding close enough to threaten us. The guy wasn't carrying anything, and I was worried that we would find his camp about the time he came back to get his belongings. We walked back down to the shallow spot in the wash and jumped down into it. I briefly recognized that the man had simply stepped down the 3 feet I had just jumped, but didn't say anything. We walked both up and down the wash 100 feet or so looking for a campsite. We didn't find one. No fire pit, no food wrappings, no trash, no drug paraphernalia, and no signs that a human has been camping there. The floor of the wash was granite and sand, so there really weren't any footprints that I couldn't recognize to indicate where he may have been. We did find a spot where someone had taken pieces of tumbleweed and thicker bush and embedded them in the wall of the wash. Tumbleweed and pieces of bush were also arranged on the floor of the wash at the same spot. Those embedded in the wall of the wash were arranged in a tall half oval with the peak about 4.5 feet high. Those on the floor of the wash were also arranged in a half oval that joined the first. It was about the right size for the guy to sit cross-legged and with his back against the wall of the wash. At the time, I have never heard of Bigfoot, so it wasn't even an option for me to consider within the framework of the encounter. Even though several things about the encounter were strange, I convinced myself that we had been confronted by a man. What else could it have been? About 10 days later, though, something happened that forced me to admit that there was something in the valley that was man-like but wasn't a man. That will be submitted in my 3rd report. Okay, so this is the last of the 3 encounters, and it also happened in August of 1972. Again, same county, Washoe County, Nevada. And this occurred in Lemon Valley. This 3rd encounter occurred in August of 1972 when I was 12 at my home, roughly 10 days after our encounter at the dry wash. I have previously described nearby Pinevine Mountain and Lemon Valley. Our house was located on the east side of the valley. It was in a new development at the time, tucked back in a draw among several steep hills. The surrounding hills rose from 50 to 250 feet above our neighborhood and were primarily granite outcroppings. The soil was coarse granite sand interspersed with boulders of various sizes. Where there was vegetation on the hills, it was predominantly sagebrush. In the draws, the sand was less coarse, and there were a variety of grasses and other weeds. We had just moved into a newly completed house a few weeks earlier and were getting to know our neighbors, all of whom had just moved into their home as well. Like many of our neighbors, we were building a fence and otherwise improving our property. At the time, there was only one thing to detract from the new neighborhood: the presence of a pack of feral dogs. The pack was comprised of 4 large dogs, 2 Dobermans, and a couple of mixed breeds. They were a matter of some concern because many of the new residents had small children, and the pack displayed absolutely no trace of fear of people. They would generally appear around dusk when it began to cool and boldly range through the neighborhood. At night, you could often hear them in the surrounding hills barking and baying occasionally. It didn't take long to determine that they had no owner, and one of our neighbors, an animal control officer for the city of Reno, told us that he had arranged for the county to do something about them. Our home was an L-shaped ranch with two of 4 bedrooms in the back, at the top of the L, and a garage in front, at the bottom right of the L facing the street. We had partially constructed a cedar plank fence around the property, starting in the back and working our way around the property clockwise. We had completed the fence on the side of the property at the top of the L, and had built a small section of fence connecting the back left corner of the L to the fence on the side. This created a small cul-de-sac behind the house. Along the side of the property to the right of the L, we had set the post and rails. Along the front, where we intended to connect it to the garage, and at the lower right corner of the L, we had set the post, but hadn't yet put in the rails. You could essentially walk right into our backyard from the street side of the house, but could not leave the yard on the back side without climbing over the fence. On the night of the encounter, I had packed up all of the 2x4s that we hadn't used as rails yet, and I stacked them horizontally along the base of the fence at the back in the cul-de-sac. This was a precaution since they were preferable and we weren't the only ones building a new fence. My bedroom was at the top right corner of the L. The ground outside of my window was about 1.5 feet below the floor of my room. My mother had already planted a small flower bed of marigolds there. To protect it, she had me put in one of those small white painted wire trellises that reminded you of a bunch of coat hangers welded together. To put it in, I had to heavily wet down the ground, then force it in. Once the ground dried, the powdered granite and sand set in like concrete. It was about 1 foot high. The incident occurred between midnight and 12:30 a.m. It was late summer and I was awake late reading. I had my window open, but the drapes were closed. That night, the pack of feral dogs had been more noisy than usual. Every so often, their barking would become particularly strident, drawing my attention away from my book. I remember thinking to myself, over the course of the 15 minutes or so, that they were chasing another jackrabbit, then decided that it must be a coyote, since they had been going at it for longer than usual, then wondering if they might have a cougar at bay, since they were still barking and baying loudly, but seemed stationary. I was just turning back to my book when I realized that they had started moving again and were coming down the street in the direction of the house. I started to sit up, intending to go to the living room window to see what they were chasing, but I realized that they would be well past the house before I could get to the living room in front. As I listened, though, the noise of the pursuit didn't decrease the way I expected it to. As they chased their quarry past the opposite side of the house, instead it grew louder, and I realized that whatever they were chasing it right into our backyard. I also realized that they might corner it behind a house in the cul-de-sac. Excited, I started to get up and look out the window. Before I could get up, though, the quarry rounded the back right corner of the garage, heading in the direction of my bedroom at the back right corner of the house. For just a second, I could clearly hear it running, as the sound of the dogs was still partially masked around the corner of the garage. As it covered the 20 feet between the two corners, I heard 3 distinct heavy footfalls. One just as it rounded the garage, one midway between the garage and the corner of the house, and the third just under my window, where the wire trellis was set firmly into the ground. This was followed by an incredible impact into the corner of the house. The force was so great that I could hear the 4x4 upright in the wall crack, and the whole room shook. The impact and cracking sound came from a point about 5.5 feet above the level of the ground outside. Simultaneously, there was a secondary impact about 7 feet above the ground level across the top right-hand corner of my window as viewed from outside. The window rattled violently in the frame, and I was sure it was cracked. Immediately following the 2 simultaneously impacts, there was a forced grunt as if the wind had been knocked out of whatever it was, and I could hear its body fall heavily to the ground. My first thought was, oh my God, they're chasing a man. The footfalls were clearly bipedal. The height of the impact was too high for it to be anything four-legged, and the sound of it having its wind knocked out of it was manlike. It was something heavy. Also, from the sound of its fall, it went from an erect to a prone position. At the same time, I recognized that something was strange. The man hadn't called for help, hadn't made any vocal noises at all. In fact, he had covered 20 feet of what was essentially 2 strides and had hit the house at a point too high for all but the largest of man. The secondary impact across the outside corner of the window was also too high for most people to reach, and the force of the impact, strong enough to make the 4x4 in the house frame crack, indicated much more mass than any normal person would have. I didn't spend any time really thinking about this though, even though I had an underlying uneasiness because that sound indicated that the guy was huge. I was sure the dogs were chasing a man. The dogs closed in on the man, snarling and barking. I was afraid he was lying on the ground, injured or unconscious, and I realized that I had to do something. I immediately threw my sheets off, jumped out of bed, and reached for the drapes, intending to throw them open and yell at the dogs, about all I could do in the situation. In the 2 or 3 seconds it took to do this, though, it didn't sound like the dogs were mauling the man. They were about 3 feet from the house, stationary, barking and growling. It sounded as if there were only 3 of them, 2 very aggressive and ready to attack, and one of them barking the way a dog would if they were afraid of you, but ready to attack if provoked. Just as my fingertips touched the drapes, the scariest thing I have ever experienced in my life happened. Believe me, this is saying a lot for someone who has spent 19 years in the military and lived through a parachute malfunction. Somehow the man had recovered from hitting the ground, having the wind knocked out of him and falling. He had somehow managed to stand up and get his breath back, and just as I touched the drapes, from a point immediately outside of my window, level with and about 2 feet from my head, he growled back at the dogs. The growl wasn't loud. It was about 2.5 seconds long, but it was the meanest, deepest, and the most menacing growl I've ever heard in my life. to include those of trapped brown bears at Yellowstone. It was almost as if it was keenly aware that there were people around, that he knew precisely how long he had to growl to get his point across, and that he didn't want to make any more noise than he absolutely had to. For the next several seconds, there was absolute silence. He didn't make any more noise. The dogs didn't even make any sound or movements. And I was frozen in fear and shock, praying that he wouldn't notice I was standing there, and afraid he would hear me if I moved at all. I was like that for several long seconds. Then, all but silently, I'd heard him step and brush around the corner of the house. A second later, the dogs were after him, but the head start was all he needed. I heard the stack of 2x4 tumble down and the sound of him hitting the 6-foot cedar fence as he went over it, followed by the dogs hitting the fence and then scratching at it and barking. After a few moments, the dog stopped trying to get over the fence and raced back around the house clockwise. As I heard the dogs racing down the street, I relaxed slightly and gulped for breath. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding it. I immediately choked. The thing had left an incredible stench. It was overpowering. It smelled like a combination of wet dog, stale urine, and rancid sweat. There was also an acrid component, a little like burnt rubber. It was so bad that I staggered away from the window. I stood there for a few minutes trying to decide what to do. The thing was gone, the dogs were gone, and all I would accomplish by waking my parents up would be to anger my father. I decided it wasn't worth it. I thought about going outside, but really didn't want to poke around out there in the dark. I was struggling with what I had just experienced. Whatever had been outside my window was man-like, but clearly was not a man. I had no frame of reference to place it in. I didn't relate the experience to my encounter at the dry wash because I had so thoroughly convinced myself that that had to be a man. I closed my window, which to my amazement was not broken, got back into bed and tried to read to get my mind off the incident. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up after my father had left for work. I looked out my window and could see that the flower bed, trellis and all, had been flattened. I got dressed and went outside. The ground was scuffed, but there was no distinctive footprints. I choked down my apprehension and walked back into the fenced cul-de-sac behind the house. The stack of 2x4s was laying there toppled. I looked at the cedar fence. The scratch marks from the dog's nails were clear. Caught on the top of one of the planks was a tuft of coarse hair. I stepped up onto the lower rail of the fence and looked at it closely in the bright morning sunlight. It was dark black with a hint of brownish-red highlight and about 3 inches long. It had enough oil on it to make it shine if you looked at it closely. I struggled with whether it had come from the thing or one of the dogs. After several moments of consideration, I decided it was possible one of the Dobermans could have had some 3-inch strand of hair, that the colors were within the appropriate range, and that one of the dogs might actually have managed to make it over the fence to leave it there. I left it where it was. I went back to the window and examined it, and the siding on the corner of the house closely. I didn't see any damage from the impacts. I decided that the thing had been running and hadn't seen the trellis and had tried to cut around the corner of the house too closely. The trellis, strongly embedded in the cement-like soil, tripped it and it fell, throwing its left arm up in an attempt to maintain balance, or maybe grab the roof to catch itself. The primary impact would have been from its body. The secondary impact could have been from the left arm slapping the side of the house across the corner of the window. I went in and told my mother about the incident. I was still very troubled and wanted her to know what I had heard. I also discussed it at length with my father when he got home. He was uncharacteristically patient and explained that it had either been a bear or a cougar. I couldn't accept either of these explanations. It wasn't until about a year later that I ran across a tourist pamphlet in Oregon that was about Bigfoot. I can't express how relieved I was at the time to learn that there was a potential explanation for what I had experienced. We never saw or heard the dogs again after that night. All I have to say is this guy is a great writer, and he knows how to write down everything that has happened in such a descriptive way that it makes everything so vivid. I know when I was reading it, it was like I was there. But in any case, I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and I am sorry for it being so long. It is super long, guys. But in any case, if these stories reminded you of an encounter that you may have had and would like to share, then please forward your encounter stories to OntarioCryptids@gmail.com. I would be honored to share your story on this channel. And thank you all for listening until the end, because this was super long, and I truly appreciate it. Please hit that like button on your way out and smash that subscribe button if you're new to my channel. And guys, have a great Sunday, and we'll see you all next week.